All right, ladies and gentlemen. So as I mentioned, chapter 3 is essential for a number of reasons. Number one, it talks about ethics in public speaking, and ethics is an important concept to consider when you understand that you have power when you're commanding the ear of a number of individuals, especially in a public forum. People are listening to you, and more often than not, they're assuming that you're giving them truthful information. They assume that you're doing whatever you're doing at the podium, and it's in the best interest of all those that are in attendance. And so, defining ethics and understanding what ethics are, consider that ethics is making the decision between right and wrong in a dilemma, right? Being ethical is more often than not saying, I understand what's right, I understand what's wrong, and hopefully that individual is siding with what is in the best interest of all parties involved, not just themselves, right? Or someone else that they are, representing or being present for. And we see this, unfortunately, a lot of times with individuals in power in politics, sometimes with celebrities, individuals in the entertainment industry, sometimes with athletes, where they have a platform and they'll utilize their platform or their ability or their access to whatever it is that they're doing for purposes that aren't necessarily ethical, right? They aren't in the best interest of all involved, but more so in the best interest of themselves. So that's where we get into the conversation of morals versus ethics, and what's the difference between morals and ethics, right? Of course, ethics, as we just talked about, is knowing that there's a right and a wrong, right? And then hopefully choosing what's right. Morals is your internal system, right? Your system of values, your beliefs, what has basically bred you or nurtured you to where you are. And that is going to determine whether or not you choose the right side or the wrong side in an ethical evaluation, right? So the ethical evaluation is in essence the general picture, and then the moral contemplation is what goes on inside of you, right? What happens internally to make you just make a decision one way or the other. Aristotle said, he proposed that if a person had ethos, and of course ethos is a form of persuasion that deals with credibility, character, the reference, right? Where when you go about creating a citation or utilizing a citation for a written assignment, that would be your ethos, but you'll be using it in an ethical way, basically finding the source, giving credit to the source, making sure that it is an adequate or an appropriate piece of information that you're utilizing. So that all is balled up inside of ethos, right? So, but if a person had ethos or credibility, they displayed good sense, goodwill, and good morals, right? And that in essence made them ethical, right? So good sense, goodwill, and good morals. If you had all three of those, then you were in essence ethical. And if you were ethical, you were able to make the right decision, meaning that you showed good morals, right? You had a good moral compass in essence. So when we get into the conversation of morals and ethics, right? Where is the threshold, right? The spectrum is what to what, right? It isn't always make a bunch of money for myself and screw everybody else, or, be a man of the people, right? It isn't always that cut dry or that black and white, right? Consider, as I have here on the slide, an individual that's struggling, right? That let's say there's a mother that has to provide food or nourishment for her children, right? She doesn't have the means to acquire this through the ethical process, right? Going into the store, putting money on the counter, getting a loaf of bread, leaving the store with that loaf of bread, right? She doesn't have the means, but in essence, she has responsibility. So this starving mother with starving kids, steals a loaf of bread, takes the loaf of bread home, feeds it to her children. Is this an ethically bad decision, or is it a morally bad decision, right? And if we go back again to the conversation about what are morals versus what are ethics, ethics, of course, is knowing what's right and wrong, right? There's a dilemma, there's a scenario where you have to make a decision between right and wrong. Morals are what guide your compass on whether you choose right or wrong, right? So this starving mother with her starving children, with her responsibility, who isn't looking to steal the bread to create, you know, the nuclear codes that are going to decimate the world, right? She isn't stealing money from children to fund her Beverly Hills penthouse, right? She's stealing a loaf of bread to feed her children. Right? Is this an unethical practice? Or is it even something that can be considered ethical at all? Or is it more a moral basis within the moral compass that she has, where she's making a decision to do something that may be deemed unethical? That's a decision that you'll have to make, and that's something that you'll be thinking about when you're creating the content that's going to fill the words that you'll disseminate from your podium. You have to make the decision, in essence, whether what you're doing is within that spectrum of right and wrong, and where you lie, where the feeling or the position lies within your heart. Consider politics, right? We'll move from the mother with the children in all the other scenarios where individuals are either acting ethically or unethically. And we'll talk about politics. The scenario on politics occurred probably before some of you were born, but with our president, who was brought into office in 1992. And he was considered one of our strongest presidents, especially within the terms of our economy. And he came after a president that was a one-term president, father of another president that actually came after this president I'm speaking of. But the one-term president came out of a war, and wasn't favorable amongst the majority of the population of the United States because of this war, which was the first Gulf War, and his mirroring of politics that happened before him from President Richard Nixon and so on. And this first president was the first George Bush, but the president that I'm speaking of that came subsequent to him, 1992 to 2000, in essence, was Bill Clinton. And so you may be familiar through your studies, and maybe even if you were alive during that time, but Bill Clinton was a very popular president, right? He played the saxophone, he utilized marijuana, but he didn't inhale, right? But he was from Arkansas. He was a favorite amongst minoritized voters, black and brown. But he also represented the majority of America at the time, and he was just considered a strong. He was strong on policies. He was going to be strong on the economy. He had formerly been the governor of Arkansas, so he had a lot of good things going for him. He won the first term handedly. He did a pretty decent job during the first term, but it was during his second term where he ran into some ethical issues and was faced with an ethical dilemma. So President Clinton had an aide, right? An aide, like a secretarial aide, an individual that worked within the Oval Office that supported him in his work, his presidential work. And you may know this young lady. She became very popular, but we won't necessarily talk about, if you read the text, then you're familiar with the story. But basically what occurred is that President Clinton engaged in some risque behavior with this individual, right? And it wasn't just after hours, right, or on their own, but there was evidence that this occurred within the White House, within the Oval Office, right? While those individuals on the clock, working, being paid by our tax dollars and doing the work that we voted him into the office to do. Now, the dilemma, right, and again, we talk about ethics versus morals, wasn't necessarily with what happened, right? One can argue that that's bad, right? Doing anything of that nature at work, especially in a public office, is not the greatest decision. But when this came to light, this individual was pressed on whether this occurred or not, right? There was, in essence, a confession or conversation that happened from the young lady that was a part of this scenario. And that individual that the young lady talked to basically went to the press, and then the press started to run with the story. And then they, of course, brought it up to the president and asked the president if there were any truth to this conspiracy, this story. And the president initially responded with, "There's no truth to this, right? It's not true at all, right?" And then pressed on a little further because it became something that snowballed. It became a larger issue. He again stated, no, I did not engage with any practice with this woman. And if you recall, a very famous quote is, I did not have sexual relations with this woman, right? That was what was stated. You know, it's recorded. It was on a podium with the entire country tuning in during a press conference. So eventually it was found through evidence, recordings, because everything's recorded in the White House, and other unsavory evidence on a dress of this young woman. And I apologize if any of this is too vulgar or problematic for anyone present. But there was other evidence that supported that something did occur, and it in fact did occur in the space that that the story supported. But this president was impeached, meaning brought up on charges that basically stated that they had done something that was in violation of their position as the president of the United States, something that was so unethical that they were brought up on charges. And if you are, in any way aware of what's happening in politics, you'll know that a current president of ours was also impeached on things that people consider unethical in terms of their role as the president of the United States. So I say that all to say, and I create that scenario for you to think about the moral compass of our president, a president that was a favorite, that did incredible things for the economy, that resurrected the country from this first Gulf War that people didn't understand, although we eventually did get into another Gulf War with the subsequent president after that, the second George Bush, conflict in the Middle East and so on and so forth. But this 92 to 2000 saw extreme economic growth. It saw extreme job growth. We developed and repaired a lot of relationships with nations across the country. The United States, the gross domestic product increased significantly. Our debt to income, our GDP ratio decreased significantly. So he did tremendous things in his job as the president, but he made a poor choice with the other work that he was doing in that space as well. And then, of course, he wasn't honest with the American public about it, right? So if ethics is about making the decision between right and wrong, and your morals guide that compass, in essence, then what does that say about necessity? What does that say about injustice? What does it say about self-preservation? Is self-preservation a bad thing? Right? Is it an ethical issue or is it a moral issue? And then when you're faced with a scenario like our previous example, our starving mother, what happens in a conflict between good and good? Good for everyone versus good for yourself. If it isn't hurting a whole bunch of people, then is it really unethical? Is it really immoral? Right? An easy way to determine where you are with your dissemination, your efforts within public speaking, is to answer the following questions. Are you going to be ethical in your speaking practice? Right? These three concepts here will help you align your words and your practice with basically coming up with an ethical base to deliver from. First and foremost, try your very best to be honest and avoid plagiarism. So when you're honest, if you're giving information, give truthful information that can be sourced, that can be cited and referenced with credible sources. And of course, if you're going to use those credible sources, and we'll learn this, if you haven't already learned this in college, if this is your first class, whatever the case, you understand that you're going to be doing a lot of citing and a lot of referencing. Guess what? That's all well and good. As long as you give credit to the source where you got the information from, then it's okay. What you don't want to get into a habit of is pulling pieces of information from sources without giving them credit, in essence, and appropriately. And you'll hear about different formats that you utilize to provide accurate and effective referencing and citations, your APA, your MLA. And I have a link on the announcements that talks about academic writing, the academic writing guide that helps with understanding APA and MLA. But more importantly, giving credit, saying this is where this information came from, right? Or I'm using this information as it's shown here or as it's stated here. That's really important. It doesn't hurt your cause, it helps your cause. Ethos is that credential or that character that's behind the information that you're providing. That basically gives you a bump up, right? It's like stepping on a stepping stool, in essence. To say, hey, I'm high, I'm looking above the fence, and I'm getting help. And sometimes people are afraid to say, hey, I'm stepping on a stepping stool. but you are only empowered that much more when you're truthful about how you got to where you are, right? Or how you got the information that you're utilizing. Again, part of that is citing the source's property, and we talked about that with MLA and APA. But number 3, set responsible speech goals. What is it that you're doing with the opportunity that you're presented with at the podium? What is it you're doing with the ears of the audience that you're utilizing, right? Because again, there's a lot of power in having the ears of the masses, whether you're informing them, persuading them, or you're doing some other celebratory task within your work. But even if you're not presenting the information, if you're in the audience, you also have a responsibility as in terms of ethics. You need to be an ethical listener. You need to develop ethical listening skills. You need to listen for honesty. You need to listen for citations or giving credit to sources, right? Because that will give you an understanding, a familiarity with who the speaker is and what they're doing with their power, in essence. There are a lot of conflicts. I don't like to get too political, but there are a lot of conflicts with our current political structure and our current administration, presidential administration, with honesty, right? And so, you know, depending on where you are on that spectrum, consider if you are being an ethical listener, is all the information that you're hearing from whichever side that you choose to assess, is it the best representation of ethics, where there is information that can be verified, it can be certified in essence, and it shows credibility, right? And it's in the best interest of all those involved, right? And then once you get that information, you're being an ethical listener and you're assessing accurately and effectively, what are you doing in terms of feedback? Because it's important to give ethical feedback if you have the opportunity to, in order to provide the checks and balances for individuals that have the power there at the podium, right? And ethical feedback is, of course, you know, asking questions, right? Doing your own research, right? Inquiring about things that are not only relevant to you, but are in the best interest of others that may be impacted or affected by this information, right? All right. Understanding ethics in terms of what we're doing, and this is academically speaking, and we can have a lot of conversations. And I left out another political story about the a congressman named Anthony Weiner, but it's a more blatant case of unethical and immoral. And the text once again has a story about his, his misfortunes. But so I won't go into that story just to save time to talk about some other things that I think are a little more important. But let's talk about what we'll do with ethics in our actual construction of our speeches, right? So once again, understanding the setting, the audience, the topic, and basically what you're doing with your content, that will help in establishing these ethical standards. Once again, it's understanding your setting. That's the place where you're creating this dissemination. That's the place where that's the podium that you're standing at. That's the room that you're in. That is the maybe the event that you're a part of. That may be the season that you are within. And that may be the space you're in, whether it's an academic space or a professional space, a public space or a personal space. But all those will play into your decision and how you're going about your ethical basis, right? When you're using the actual content, this is again more academic in terms of our creation of our speeches, our outlines, using resources like our citations and our references. But you should check your sources and ensure that you're using the most accurate source of information, right? If you're using something like Wikipedia to gather information, I talked about this on Monday. It's not that Wikipedia is a bad source. It's that anyone can change the information there, so you have to be wary of how you're going about determining the credibility of those sources, right? At the bottom of a Wikipedia page, and I'll actually show you really quickly. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, okay, all right. So I think you should see, do you see the Wikipedia homepage there? Give me a thumbs up if you do. Just making sure you guys see the same thing. Okay, awesome. All right, so let's say I'm looking up, let's keep it consistent. Let's say, So the President of the United States, right? All right. So if you're looking at a Wikipedia page, tons of information here, great source of information, right? You have all these blue links that will give you hyperlinks to other pages of information. You have this description here. You have all this stuff. You have all these footnotes. If you see the numbers here, they're footnotes, and they'll say, hey, this information is garnered from this Time magazine on Steve Bannon. This one here is garnered from a Guardian article, 2008. This one here is an article in Newsweek from 2010. This one here is another Newsweek article. But you have all this information. But in order to determine if it's accurate, to do your checks and balances, what you want to do is you want to go all the way down through all the information, and you want to check this area right. Wait for it. There we go. Right here. The references, right? So when you find a piece of information here and it has a blue hyperlink or maybe a footnote next to it, you want to go click on that information, and that will give you a hyperlink or take you directly to the source where you can determine if it is an appropriate piece of information, right? You're checking the source, right? What you want to be careful of is when there's no reference there for the information, right? Or if the reference looks a little sketchy, it's from a publication you've never heard of before, right? You know, like for this one here, how to address the president, right? He's not your excellency or your honor, but Mr. President. This article is dated 1891, right? That may be accurate, but maybe you want to click on it to just determine, right? Maybe it's like a file from a library that they have in the microfilm or something like that. Maybe this, you know, maybe they digitized it or something, but because it's 1891, I want to double check and make sure that's not something that someone's just making up, right? Also from a publication that I've never heard of before. If I'm not familiar with like, you know, I trust the Guardian, but let's say I'm not familiar with the Guardian, right? Publication out of London, right? Then maybe I'll click on it and I'll determine if the website looks accurate, if it has a copyright date, if there's an actual author, right? If there are other prominent articles there that maybe look like they have a little more reference. So those are things that you want to take into consideration when you're looking at sources and determining the accuracy of them, okay? And I'm just giving you one example, Wikipedia, but there are tons of other examples, right? All right, so let's jump back to our PDF. All right. Acknowledge your sources. We talked about this. This is giving credit, right? And how to do that. Here I put in a table this is from our actual text from chapter 3. It's a table within chapter 3. It's table 3.1. There may be more than one 3.1 in there, but this specifically talks about the Al Purdue APA guide for citing sources. When to cite and when it is not necessary for you to cite, right? For instance, you would cite words or ideas presented in a magazine, book, newspaper, song, TV program, movie, web page, computer program, letter, advertisement, or any other medium. You would cite those things because they are stated there first. You do not need to cite writing your own lived experiences, your own observations and insights, your own thoughts, and your own conclusions about a subject, as long as it doesn't use the content or the intellectual property from one of these other sources, right? You have to be careful about that. But if you look at the table, it just talks about when you would utilize the citation, right? The actual act of saying this comes from this source, or even quoting it with quotation marks when you're stating something verbatim, right? Or you would reference it if you're paraphrasing and you're not using an actual quote. You may not use quotation marks, but you still would need to say this information comes from this source, right? But if you're going to not give credit, right, there is a term for that as well. That term is plagiarism. Plagiarism is not a great thing in academia, right? It can derail your academic work. It can derail your academic career if that's what you're working towards. And it can basically lend you to be uncredible, unreliable, and unethical. And you don't want that moniker, right? As you can see, even with my slides, I give credit at the bottom here. All slide contents derived from electronic publication of various authors and sources extracted from www.publicspeakingproject.org 2011, right? So that means that I'm pulling information from our text, and it's a generalized citation, but all content for the most part. Even if there are things that here that are my own ideas, intellectually, I'm garnering the property from my awareness and affiliation and familiarity with the content that's within the text. So it's important that I have that disclaimer there, so you know I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not super genius creating these tables from my own experiences, which could happen if you have a lot of experiences. But it's important for you to know, hey, this is in the textbook. But when you do utilize plagiarism, it isn't just one type, where anything you do that you don't give credit to, or that you don't cite, or you don't use quotation marks, is just plagiarism in general. There's different types of plagiarism, and us as academic faculty, professors, it's important that we look out for these specific types of plagiarism. So the first one, of course, is global plagiarism. And you can imagine what global means. When you say global with anything, usually you're speaking of the entire collection of all things, right? On the globe, or whatever the case. But in terms of plagiarism, it's the entire collection of writing, right? You just plagiarize the whole thing. You copy the article from Wikipedia or whatever, you paste it on your paper, you format it a little bit, put some indentations there, maybe play with the font or the font size or whatever the case, and then you turned it in. That's global plagiarism. The whole thing's a hoax. The whole thing is Fox, and it's you're going to get enough for that, right? But there's another type of plagiarism that has become more popular, and it's patchwork plagiarism. That's when you steal a paragraph here, a sentence here, right? And you patch them in there, and maybe in between those things, you might put a sentence or two of your own, right? And it's a little more difficult to catch than the blatant global plagiarism, but it's still obvious, and we have a lot of systems that we use that we run discussions and papers through to determine whether or not plagiarism has occurred. But your best bet is just to give credit where you got the source from. You can copy verbatim a whole bunch of content from a source as long as you give credit. Now that may not necessarily bode well for you academically if you're just using someone else's words, even if you're giving them credit, because we of course want to know that you can analyze and put things into your own thought process and consciousness and create feedback in relation to the information that you're using, not solely consisting of the information that you're using, right? But patchwork plagiarism is a thing as well. Now, the last plagiarism here, and these are on the exam, so just keep those in mind, the types of plagiarism. But incremental plagiarism is where you're still in a phrase here, a couple of words here, and you're just doing it incrementally throughout your work, right? And you think, hey, because it's not a full sentence, or I'm just doing it sporadically throughout my paper, I don't need to give credit, right? But still, if it's any kind of concept that's derived from another individual, another source, it's important for you to basically, even if you're paraphrasing, right, go ahead and give credit, right? It helps out, it's beneficial for all parties involved, and it just saves you the trouble of having to clarify after the fact, whether or not you stolen information. All right, so types of plagiarism: global, patchwork, and incremental. And then areas where you cite and do not cite are here, but don't forget, on the announcements on Canvas, I have that academic writing guide that's beneficial to you, okay? Also, I'll put a couple other tables here. This is, once again, will be posted on Canvas, but this is all in the text as well. But what written citations would look like, what oral citations would look like. This is extremely important as we move forward and start to build our confidence in writing and start to understand our outlining and our organizing, which we'll talk about on Monday next week. It is extremely important for you to understand that you will need to utilize written citation with oral citations, right? The reason is because within your outline, once you get to your informative speech, your persuasive speech, your group exercise or group presentation, and also that final speech, you'll be required to utilize a certain number of references where you're pulling information from. And it's going to be important that you cite these in your outline in the correct areas within within your speech, how you're constructing your speech, but also when you actually go to give your speech at the podium, whether you're doing it live on Zoom or you're doing it in an actual room for your friends or your family, or you're recording on your own, you're going to send me a video after the fact. I need to see in the video that you are also citing the source of this information. For instance, if I am citing The Guardian and talking about the office of the president, in my outline, I'm going to quote, according to The Guardian 2018, the office of the president is part of the executive branch of government, right? And it consists of the president and the vice president and the president's cabinet, right? End quote, period, right? Period, end quote. That would be what's in my actual outline. If I use that piece of information in my actual speech, I don't get to forego the citation. It is still important that I specify the citation, or it's still considered plagiarism. And the reason why is because more often than not, when you are disseminating information from a podium, there will not be an outline posted behind you on a projector screen, right? You won't be handing your outline out to everyone sitting in the audience. You'll be there, you'll present yourself, you'll present your topic, and you'll go into your speech. And if you don't add the citation to the information that you're providing, then guess what happens? The audience thinks it comes from you, and in turn, it's plagiarism. So I would do the same thing when I'm providing that information during my speech about the Guardian. The office of the presidency is extremely important. According to the Guardian 2008 out of London, think about this. The office of the presidency is part of the executive branch of government. So that means that within that executive branch, you have the president, the vice president, and the president's cabinet, right? And that consists of the administration. Basically what I did was I referenced it beforehand. You can do it after the fact too. I can say the executive branch of the presidency is that consists of the president, the vice president, and the president's cabinet. And this information comes from the Guardian 2008 out of London, right? But I'm still giving credit. So you can, and here's a couple of different ways you can do it if you're using original text, if you're paraphrasing, if you're using a direct quote. When you are doing the oral citation for paraphrase or the oral citation for the direct quote, it gives you that information on how to do that. Keep that in mind for later. Don't worry, I will highlight that. I will imprint that. I'll be consistent in providing information. The citation happens in the outline. The citation happens in your oral presentation, both places, and you'll be assessed as such. All right. Last but not least here, let's look at unethical and ethical feedback. What does that mean when we're giving feedback? I talked about that as a part of ethical listening. You're going to obviously listen for credibility. You're going to listen for sources. You're going to listen for the intent of the speaker, but then you're going to get feedback. And how do you do that? Well, unethical feedback is feedback that is generalized. It isn't specific to the content, and it doesn't reflect that you are listening for things that are very specific, right, from the content. Unethical feedback consists of something like, I really enjoyed your speech. Your speech lacks supportive information, or you are the worst public speaker ever, right? That is feedback. It is an ethical feedback because you don't hold the speaker accountable by giving them specific information, right? That will help them in these areas that you are highlighting, right? So for instance, ethical feedback in relation to those pieces of criticism, in essence, are as follows. Instead of, I really enjoyed your speech, I really enjoyed your speech because your topic was personally interesting to me, right? So instead of just telling a person you enjoyed their speech and they have no idea why, and they can't build on that information, because that's what we're here for, of course. We're here to make each other better, right? But part of being ethical is doing the right thing, which is giving someone specific information so they can build on that and understand that's something that works for them, that they can either build upon or that they don't necessarily need to focus on next time they're building content or they're disseminating information. How about this? Instead of providing feedback that your speech lacks supportive information, your speech lacked supportive information because you didn't cite any outside information. Instead, you use yourself as the only source when there's no way you could be the source, right? Because your speech was about ancient Egypt or whatever the case, right? But you gave them specific information that led to your you arriving at this assumption or this conclusion that they lacked supportive information. Be specific as to why. And that's holding them accountable, and that in essence is that ethical feedback, right? All right, so let's just unpack what we went over with ethics before we talk about immediacy and mind mapping. Immediacy and mind mapping are going to help in our conversation about chapter 11, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But ethical speaking is, of course, the foundation, the baseline for our creation of our content. There are other things that you're going to take into consideration when you're building content for your speech. You're going to take into consideration your audience. You're going to do audience analysis. We'll talk about that in chapter 5. You're going to, of course, utilize sources, and that's going to build in ethics. But of course, there's a process to that. We'll talk about that in chapter 7. That's supporting your sources or supporting your speech, right? You're going to understand how to build your outline and organize. Again, that's chapter 8. We'll talk about that on Monday. And then we're going to look at introductions and conclusions that will help in garnering audience attention, and of course, closing out your speech and restating information and providing the most relevant information within those bookends of your speech. And we'll talk about that on Wednesday next week. So there are a couple other areas that will aid in your ability to utilize ethics within creating the content, all right? But it's important for you to just kind of go over these things on your own within the text, and then consider them when you're actually building the outline for your speech, which you should probably be starting this weekend after your exam, because next week will be when we have our first speech next Friday or so, will be our Who Am I? Introducing Cultural Artifacts speech. Right? All right, so let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit, and let's talk about immediacy. Let's talk about mind mapping, which in essence is a part of brainstorming. And let's talk about how those things can be beneficial for you in creating your content. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about immediacy, right? I'm grabbing a piece of paper here because I also want to show you a practice that you'll utilize in brainstorming and mind mapping, all right? So immediacy is the quality of bringing one into direct and instant involvement with something, or giving a rise to a sense of urgency and excitement, right? Immediacy is extremely important because it will be relevant in any content that you create for public dissemination at any point in time in public speaking. You must utilize immediacy. You must make it an immediate relevant thing for your audience, right? No matter what it is. If you're talking about autonomous cars, right? Cars that drive themselves, make it immediate, connected with today. If you're talking about the history of the Ford Motor Company, make it immediate, connected with today. If you're talking about politics or the office of the presidency, make it immediate, connected with today. If you're talking about the women's suffrage movement versus the civil rights movement, make it immediate, make it relevant today, right? Immediacy is extremely important because if you don't have that sense of urgency and excitement, it's dated information. It becomes stale, right? It's important for you to keep it as fresh as possible so you can garner the most attention and keep the attention span of your audience, right? So you have to make it relevant to them today. We have historical buffs all over the place. I'm a historical buff. I love history. But I also want to know how it's relevant today, right? What's the bridge between what happened way back then and what we're doing now, right? And that makes it interesting and engaging to me, right? So if I think about something like the First World War, right? I think about the conflicts that were involved in that, the decision-making that happened within these high ranks of military and government. And I think about how that reflects or how that parallels with what's happening today. You know, could we be close to another conflict of that nature? Well, it's important to understand that historical context, but in order to be able to bring it to today. So for instance, if I were going to, engage in a speech about how Cracker Jacks and Cracker Jacks and hot dogs were the first concessions or first things that were sold at early baseball games, right, in the early 1900s. Right? I will want to make that relevant today, and how I'll make that relevant to today is I would talk about, well, what concessions sell now, right? In the 1920s, you could probably purchase a box of Cracker Jacks and a hot dog for, a couple cents on the dollar. Today, if you go to the concession stands, you're going to spend very many dollars, right? You're going to spend $20, $30, $40 on a meal, probably just for yourself. And it's a lot different than it was back in those days, right? But there's still a simplicity, right? A nostalgia that comes from considering that when you went to this concession, you got your Cracker Jacks, you got your hot dog, and you got your pop, right? Or you got your drink or whatever it is, and it probably cost you a couple of cents. Why is that important, right? Or why is that something that was enjoyable then and something that people may want to go back to, right? So I would try to create this connection or this bridge to make audiences today who may not be relevant with that time frame because they weren't present, who may not necessarily, even be able to conceptualize the concept because maybe they're not into baseball or they aren't into sports or they don't like spending money, they're very frugal or whatever the case. But I want to connect those concepts to make it, inviting and make it a space where everyone wants to, hopefully not only pay attention, but be engaged and provide feedback. So that's the goal of immediacy. We'll talk about immediacy more once we get into our actual speeches. But for instance, if you're thinking about your who am I cultural artifact speech, you're going to start to build the who am I portion of your speech based on a cultural artifact, in essence, something. And that cultural artifact may be something that's dated, that's old, right? Maybe it may be something that you received from a family member, grandmother, or uncle, or aunt, or a parent. It may be a picture, maybe a toy, it may be a religious artifact, whatever the case. And again, it doesn't have to be a physical artifact. We'll talk about that next week. But whatever it is, you have to bring it into now. You have to give a sense of urgency and excitement about this artifact that you may have had for 20 or 30 years, right? So it's important to know that it's something that you need to work at. You need to build that and make a connection to who your audience is right now and how that's going to impact their day, right? Or what they're going to do with that information after they leave your speech, right? That's the goal of immediacy. Now, to help in building speeches, you of course are going to brainstorm, and we're kind of wrapping all immediacy, mind mapping, and brainstorming up into one conversation. So I'm going to stop my screen share for a second, just so we can talk about what mind mapping is. I'll bring it back, of course, because it's important to see a couple of examples. But if you don't have a piece of paper in front of you that you can grab, or a notebook or something like that, that's totally okay. You can pay attention to me on my screen here. But what I want to do is I want to just show you what mind mapping is. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have a piece of paper here, and I am going to start to work on my Who Am I? Introduction to our cultural artifact speech, right? So what I'm going to do with this piece of paper is I'm going to engage in a practice that I call mind mapping, right? But it's a two-part process. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of paper here, and again, you can work along with me, or you can just kind of utilize this. But I'm going to take this piece of paper and I'm going to fold it over hamburger style, if you remember from elementary school. So that means I'm going to make sure it's not landscape. This is considered landscape here, but it's portrait, right? And then I'm going to fold it over top to bottom, like Pac-Man or like a hamburger or something, not like the long way, but short way, right? Once I do that, I'm going to crease it, right? And this is going to give me two sides in essence, right? Even where I can hide one side if necessary. And this is how I'm going to start my brainstorm process, right? So consider what mind mapping is. As we saw on the slide, and I'll show you again, mind mapping is, of course, a way you can make a visual, non-linear brainstorming tool that will basically spark creativity and stimulate you in creating content for your outline that will eventually become your speech, right? Why is mind mapping important? Mind mapping is a tool for the brain that captures thinking that goes on inside your head, right? And it helps you think. It helps you collect information or knowledge. It helps you remember and create ideas. But you have to start somewhere. So I'm going to start with a brainstorm. So with this piece of paper right here, I am going to brainstorm at the top. So basically, this first part right here, I'm going to make this my brainstorm, right? So I'm going to actually write brainstorm on it. What I like to do sometimes is I like to actually make a cloud, a brainstorm cloud. So I'm actually going to do that. You don't necessarily have to do that if you feel it's too elementary for you. But for me, it just kind of makes the process a little more fun. I enjoy creative writing and all that stuff. So, all right. So I have my brainstorm and my brainstorm cloud, right? Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and just give myself an exercise. I'm going to give myself 30 seconds, right? My little timer here. 30 seconds. Boom. And I'm going to give myself 30 seconds to think of as many things as I can to fulfill this criteria here, this category of who am I. I'm going to write down as many things that come to my mind in 30 seconds. That's some of my brainstorms. I'll let me brainstorm a little bit, and I'm going to start my timer, and I'm going to write down as many things as I can that have to do with me. So I'm going to do my brainstorm out loud now since we're kind of live on the Zoom thing. All right, but I'm going to say, who am I? I am a father. I'm a teacher, right, or professor, for being, right? I am an artist, right? I am a traveler, right? I am a son, brother, right? I kind of ate into my 30 seconds with the explanation there, but copy down a bunch of things. Don't worry about my messy handwriting, okay? I'll put down a bunch of things here. Now, these things are important because they'll help me create my mind map, right? So once I finish my brainstorm where I have my cloud, I have a couple things in there, maybe I feel like I didn't get enough content. I want to put more stuff in there. I'll give myself another 30 seconds. Or instead of 30 seconds, maybe I give myself 5 minutes, right? You want to give yourself a limit. So just like for any storm, you know, if it's storming outside for too long, we're going to flood, right? So you want there to kind of be an end to the storm, just so you won't have too much content. You want just enough that you gave yourself the challenge of coming up with stuff in a short time frame, but you don't want to have too much stuff in there, even if you have more time to come up with more stuff, because then you have to break it down. You have to, like, you know, make smaller groups of information that it may be hard to do if you have too much, right? Okay, so to get to my mind map, I'm going to use the second part of my paper now, right? So remember I creased it right there. You see the crease, right? I'm going to use the second part down here now. All right, so I'm going to write mind map, right? So I wrote mind map down there, as you can see, and I'm going to actually create a mind map. And I'm going to start with an inner circle, who am I, right? Who am I is going to be inside my big circle right there. And then I'm going to start a process where I'm just creating a mind map, or basically a route from our origin to other destinations, just like a map, like roads. Let's say I want to come up with 3 main ideas for my who am I speech, yeah? So 1, 2, 3. I got 3 roads for my origin, just like a map. The first one, I'm going to pull from content that's inside my brainstorm. So don't forget, in the brainstorm, you have content. I have father, teacher, professor, artist, traveler, son, brother, right? I'm going to pull my first one, which is my most prominent one, that's father. I'm a father. So there we go. Father is going to be one of my destinations. I'll take my mind map. Who am I? Father is one place. Go ahead and put another one down there. Teacher. Right? Another destination. Let's do one more. Artist. So I have teacher, father, artist. Once I have those 3 destinations, those routes, I basically start my map. Then I can break down those individual areas, and I can start to give more content, more context, more description into how those things are basically make up who I am. So I can think of, let's say I want to start with artist. How am I an artist? I think I'm very creative, right? I think poetry, and then artist because I am unique. So for artists, I'm into breaking artists down and making it a little more specific, as you can see here. Artist, creative, unique, poetry, right? So if I were to go into who I am and use whatever cultural artifact I want, but I want to connect these 3 things, father, teacher, artist, right? Maybe I use one of my notepads, my poetry pads or something like that, because of course I have reflections on my time as a father in there. And of course I was able to garner the skills to be creative through education, the education that I received, and also my work as a facilitator within a classroom. And then, of course, is reflective of my my artistry, right? What I'm writing in there. So that notepad can be, I have a ton of them here. That notepad can be my artifact, right? And I go into my who am I speech. Greetings, everyone. My name is Professor Foreman, and I want to start off this the speech here by giving you a little context. I'm sorry. Everyone here has something that makes up who they are, right? A symbol in essence. My symbol, of course, is this notepad here. This is my cultural artifact, and it reflects a large part on what my culture is and who I am. The 3 main things I want to talk about within my who am I speech is, of course, the fact that I'm a father, that I'm a teacher, and that I'm an artist. And my cultural artifact will assist me along the way, right? So that could be a brief, rough introduction to your who am I speech, but it would start with this practice right here of brainstorming and mind mapping, right? So that was very brief. You may have caught that. You may have kind of glazed over that a little bit, but let's jump back to our slide and let's look at actual representations of our mind mapping that are a little more creative and colorful. little more engaging. All right, let me see. Let me double check the chat here. Sorry, I got a couple things here. Oh, gotcha. You won't say anything. Okay. Question was about the discussions and whether they will pertain to chapters 3 and 11. Yeah, I mean, the discussions in essence, they kind of encompass all a bunch of different aspects from public speaking. So they aren't necessarily directed towards the chapters per se. It may seem like they are from those first two discussions that you've seen, but just because we're doing an introduction to public speaking, and then of course we're talking about origins of public speaking. But as we move forward, it'll be less specific to the chapter title and more about just the practice that we're engaging in as we go through public speaking throughout the weeks. So there won't necessarily be a direct relationship between the discussion and chapters each time. It'll just require you to kind of have familiarity with the content, and then using context clues, using your own analysis and your own route, and where you're going through with your own speeches to respond to the discussion. But of course, using the textbook for referencing and citation at all times. So Anthony, I hope that answered your question about discussions that pertain to chapters 3 and 11. Okay, so let's jump back, share my screen now so we can see the mind map. And let me just double check and make sure we're all still. If you can see my screen here, just give me a thumbs up if you don't mind. Awesome, awesome, thank you. Okay, all right, so let's check out mind mapping, shall we? All right, a mind map. This mind map here is from MindMeister. I think it's mindmeister.com on Google, and it is a representation of my rough version of a mind map, but a little more creative. And of course, the focus is mind mapping. So if you were doing an informative speech on organization, and maybe you wanted to highlight a specific type of organization like mind mapping, this is the route you would go. And you would maybe start with that main concept of mind mapping. Then you would branch off to benefits, planning, collaboration, productivity, and creativity. Those 5 main areas that are highlighted by the colors there, the green, red, purple, or pinkish, yellow, and blue, those would be ideas that would be garnered from an initial brainstorm. So you do your brainstorm like I talked about with the cloud. Your topic would be mind mapping, and maybe in that brainstorm you would think of all the things that brainstorming can do, right? It can give you it has benefits to it. It can aid you with planning. It's part of being creative. It's part of collaborating with different ideas and maybe working with different people. And then it will aid in productivity, right? So that's what they got from their initial brainstorm. And then once you have those 5 areas that you branched off from your main topic, then you can start to be more specific in figuring out smaller areas that will promote those branch offs, right? And in essence, those 5 main areas can become your 5 main ideas, right? And then those smaller areas that are branching off, for instance, if you're looking at planning right now in the red, projects, goals, and strategies, those become your subpoints. So basically, if you're looking at this mind map, if you have experience and you understand the organization and structure of a public speaking endeavor, I can create a speech right now just using this mind map without necessarily having an outline. I don't recommend that, but you can. Basically, you can go into the topic. So greetings, ladies and gentlemen. What I'd like to do right now is I would like to just have a couple minutes of your time to talk to you about something that's extremely important that may aid in your day-to-day organization, that may help you in your public pursuit or your professional pursuit, and even in your personal lives, and may allow you to feel a little more comforted as you go through all the complicated and convoluted things that we have to do in life. Mind mapping. Mind mapping is, of course, a practice, or organizational practice, where you start to organize things that are in your head a certain way. You can do this in your mind. You can also do this on paper. There are 5 main areas that I think are beneficial to understand when you're going through the mind mapping process. The first area, of course, are the benefits of mind mapping. The second area will be planning, how you go about the act of mind mapping. The third, of course, is the creativity that can be garnered and that is required in the practice of mind mapping. Then, of course, the collaboration that can be, hopefully something that you can benefit from through the practice of mind mapping. Last but not least, the productivity that comes from effective mind mapping. Let's start with planning. If you're going to plan your mind mapping endeavor, and of course, through mind mapping in and of itself, you will, of course, be aided in attempting projects, reaching goals, and strategizing to do both of those things and even more. Let's move to benefits. Now, if planning is something that you really want to do, and of course, working on those projects, those goals, and creating those strategies is something that interests you, then there'll be benefits, okay? You obviously will have a greater overview of what you're doing because you'll see all the nuances, right? The idiosyncrasies and the specifics. It'll be easier to memorize things if you put them in a codified system. And of course, mind mapping allows things to be a little more simple, a little faster, and a little more fun. Now, how does this aid in collaboration? Right? And I can go on and on and on, right? That can easily be a 5 to 6 minute speech. But all I'm doing is looking at the mind map, right? I didn't write any of that down. And of course, I'm a little more confident, right? Because I've been doing public speaking for a long time, right? But that is basically what happens with a mind map. You can create an outline from your mind map, and the mind map basically took 30 seconds or maybe a couple minutes to create through a brainstorm, right? And that's why it's so beneficial. Let's look at one more mind map before we move on to chapter 11. I'm gonna take up too much of your time here. But let's say your focus is something else, like family, right? And this would probably be something that aligns a little more with what you do with your Who Am I, Introduction to Cultural Artifact speech. But with your family, you're going to think about a couple of things. So you write family at the top of your brainstorm, like I did with my little brainstorm paper. And then you're going to give yourself some time, and you're going to think of all the things that come to mind with family. Family, okay. Who's my family? All right, it's my mom, dad, siblings, whatever. Where do they live? Are they here in the same city? Are they in the same house? Are they scattered around the country, the globe? What do we do together, right? Or maybe the fact that we don't spend time together, or whatever. That might be another category. What do they like to do, or who are they? Their characteristics or their personality traits or whatever, right? And that can be 4 main ideas right there. And then you'll branch off and you'll find more specific things within those main ideas. So as you can see here, these are the 4 main ideas I just mentioned. And then you branch off, and who are they? Dad, Mike, siblings, Alan and Katie. Things that we do together. We go to art museums, we go on vacation, we go bowling, we go to the movies. Where they live? Chicago, the Bay Area, Seattle, Washington, New York, whatever the case, right? What do they like to do, right? Mom likes to eat food, good food. She likes to exercise. She likes to hang out with friends and family. Dad likes to make art. He likes to fish. Sister likes to hang out with friends. She likes to make art as well, right? So you can create a whole speech about your family using these main ideas. So I want to talk about my family, and I want to talk about who they are. I want to talk about where they live. I want to talk about the things that we do together and what they like to do individually, right? And then you go into all these sub-ideas, and then you give a little bit of information about the sub-ideas, right? And then if you're thinking about these speeches that we're doing, they're 3 to 4 minutes for your cultural artifact speech. They're 5 to 6 minutes for your informative and persuasive speeches, right? 4 to 5 minutes for your final speech. You don't have a whole lot of time. This is sufficient, the information that you have here. You'll be more specific. You're going to be obviously more aligned to your own experiences and your own information. And then, of course, in some of those speeches, you'll have to reference information from credible sources, and you have to add that in there. But as you can see, the mind map makes this process, I think, a little easier, a little more attainable, sensible, simplistic, and more engaging, right? So let's go ahead and transition from mind mapping and immediacy as a part of ethics and also just creation of our speech to chapter 11, right? And try to get you guys out of here in a decent time here. Do you have any questions so far for in relation to chapter 3, immediacy, mind mapping, any of that stuff? You can either raise your hand. Go ahead.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
So for the mind mapping, was that in chapter 3, or was it just like you added?
Not necessarily. I like to connect it with chapter 3 because chapter 3 is about ethics, and one may not know the best way to go about their references. They're finding information that's going to support the content that they're utilizing. Now, remember, for the Who Am I cultural artifact speech, you don't have to have any references for that. I assume that most of the stuff is going to come from your own experiences. You absolutely can pull information from sources and cite it if necessary. For instance, if you have a dream catcher on your wall and you want to use that as an artifact because it's something that an ancestor gave to you, and you want to reference what a dream catcher is, then you may have a citation or reference that you'll throw in there with the citation. It isn't necessary, but you can do that. and that may give you, but basically what you do with a mind map is then you can start to get all those ideas together. And for instance, if I'm talking about family, maybe I want to add a quote for family in there. And then I can do that with my mind map. It helps me to understand where I can even put in this information that will help with an ethical foundation for my speech. So
Okay.
in essence, it may, be more aligned to chapter 8, organizing and outlining, or maybe even chapter 10, using language well. There's a couple other areas, but just think of this as more foundational, right?
Okay.
Less specific to chapter 3 and more foundational. We're getting to foundational stuff as we go into week 3, chapters 8 and chapters 9 that will lead up to our Who Am I speech. So this is more aligned with foundational understanding of building content for your speech.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. All right, so any other questions? I am here for your questions. I'm just changing PowerPoints here, or PDFs. All right, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 11, confidence with, speaking with confidence, or confidence in public speaking. Hopefully you can see my page here. Let's go ahead and full screen that. All right. What is it about speaking in public that wrecks our confidence, makes us anxious, makes us crazy, that causes fear and despair? It is, in essence, communication apprehension, right? And it is something that the majority of us face. Upwards of 20% of the population face communication apprehension, and we'll get into more of the statistics in a minute. But what is that? What is fear of public speaking, right? Communication apprehension is, of course, apprehension in communication, right? You're apprehensive, right? You are hesitant. You can't find the space or the energy, right? Or the focus to be confident in the task that's ahead of you, which is standing at a podium and talking to people. And that could include any number of individuals, from 2 to 200, right? 20 to 2 million. But sometimes it helps when we are using different mediums and modalities like we're doing here. It may be easier to do a speech here. 30,000 people are connected to you via YouTube or Zoom. It might not be as daunting as if those people were in front of you in an actual live venue. But we'll talk about communication apprehension here. It's defined by 3 specific brands or types, right? All right. As I mentioned, that statistic there talks about the 20% of the United States population having this high degree of communication apprehension. Now, you probably think of 20% is not a lot, right? That's 20 cents off a dollar, right? Or $20 off of $100, right? But if you think about the population of the United States, which is upwards of 300 million people, right? 20% of that is a large number, right? 50%, of course, is 150. So half of that is about 75. So you think about 70 million, 60 to 70 million people, right, that are impacted by communication apprehension. That's a lot of people that are afraid to speak in public, right? That fear public speaking more than death itself. They'd rather just go ahead and die, I say that with respect, of course, than to speak in front of a group. That information is from McCroskey, 1976. So it's a little dated. I would argue that communication apprehension is probably decreased because of our access to technology and social media, because so much more is, we're extroverted in so many of our activities this day and age, especially with our pandemic. But I would say that the degree of communication apprehension has probably gone down a lot in the last 50 years. But regardless, let's talk about what it is. Communication apprehension is, of course, that feeling, that isolating phenomenon where you feel alone, right? You're up there and it's like, what was I going to say? Oh my God, what is the point of this? I don't want to do it anymore. This is silly. Everyone hates me. Everyone's judging me, all that stuff, right? It's a combination of that, of course, your self-esteem, right? How you feel about yourself. You may be the most confident person in the world in front of a mirror when no one else is looking, right? But when you're in front of a whole bunch of eyes that are studying you, that are scrutinizing you, that are judging you, right? Self-esteem and self-confidence kind of take on a whole new meaning, right? It also affects your level of success in work and school, right? If you suffer from communication apprehension, you're going to be less likely to speak out and be participatory in the academic setting. And you're going to be less likely to be participatory and stand out in a professional setting. And that could mean opportunities for you that, unfortunately don't pan out. And obviously, communication apprehension can result in miscommunication and misunderstanding, right? When you can't adequately communicate what it is that you're feeling, what you're thinking, you can't produce when you're in these settings, then people may misunderstand who you are, what you stand for, or who you're representing. And that can be problematic, again, professionally or even publicly, right? So let's talk about the three brands or types of communication apprehension. There are three specific types of communication apprehension that you have to consider. There is trait anxiety, state anxiety, and of course, scrutiny fear. Now, your brand of communication apprehension has developed through your life. This is solely for you. While it may align or be similar to what someone else is experiencing in this setting, it is a result of your experiences, your life, the things that that have happened to you, that you are going through, and they've kind of built this frame or this perspective on public speaking that you have, right? It's very unique, right? Even though communication apprehension is, of course, uniform throughout society. Now, what is it in essence, right? If we were to think about a Cliff Notes version or a layman's definition, communication apprehension is, of course, a non-universal version of stage fright. So it isn't stage fright for everyone. It's a little different, differs, but it's your own emotional trauma, right? Let's look at it more specifically. So trait anxiety, of course, is aligned with your personality. Now, you know, your personality you can have a boisterous personality, an outgoing personality. You can have a more shy or introverted personality. You know, you could have a more neurotic personality, right? And this type of scrutiny, this type of communication apprehension is going to be very specific to your type of personality. So maybe judgment is a thing for you. You worry about people judging you. So when you get at the podium, your communication apprehension may, follow suit with that, and you may feel like people are judging you, or thinking about you a certain way, or looking at a specific aspect of your personal appearance. Maybe something that you're uncomfortable with. If you're uncomfortable with your teeth, or your nose, or your hair, the size of your face, or your eyes, your hands, your posture, whatever the case, then you may think that people are judging or scrutinizing you on that, when there may not be any evidence to support it. That's just how you feel internally. But that's trait anxiety, traits that make you anxious, your own individual traits that make you anxious, right? You want to avoid the judgment of others to the extent that a pattern of self-skepticism and hesitancy develops. So again, it's not that anyone actually said anything or you have any proof of anyone, judging you in this manner, but because you feel that way about yourself, right? You project those feelings out there into the audience, and they're deflected off to people who may not feel that way, and they come right back to you, right? And it's everyone else that feels that way, and not just how you feel. Now, state anxiety is similar, but it's a little different. State anxiety is aligned with external situations. So let's say you were the most confident person in high school, right? You had friends, you had good hair, right? You maybe got to drive mom or dad's car every now and again, right? You were feeling yourself, you're doing all right. Then one day at the pep rally, you're running to catch up with one of your friends, someone sticks your leg out, you go sliding across the quad on the grass. Grass stains on your white jeans, right? Face embarrassed, you got mud spots on your nose. Everybody's laughing. They completely forget what the pep rally is about because you just did it, right? That confidence is going to change. It wasn't that you had an underlying trait that specifically gave you an insecurity. It was a scenario, right? Falling in front of a bunch of people at an event that is going to be polarizing for that stage in your life. Well, guess what? That can stick with you. In any other opportunity where you're going to be in front of people, you may think, I'm going to trip and fall, right? Something's going to happen and I'm going to be embarrassed. People are going to judge me on that singular thing and nothing else that I have to offer in this opportunity to disseminate. And that's a state of anxiety. That's aligned with external situations. It's stemming from a negative experience or something that you experienced yourself or something that was observed, right? Consider you're watching the news, right? And you see a happy couple together and the one party, the male or female is going to, the man or woman is going to propose to the other man or woman, and they drop the ring, right? Or they stumble and fall, right? Or they say the wrong word, or an old fling comes out of the crowd and hits them on the head with a purse, or whatever the case. It's like, oh my God, it's just so embarrassing. Oh, I could never do that. I would never do that in a public setting. I would never put myself in such a vulnerable state with so many people around. Well, guess what? Then you have an opportunity to give a speech, right? And they say, all right, what you're going to do is carry this thing up to the podium, right? And you're going to talk about it. And all you can think about is, oh, remember that guy? He was like holding it and he dropped it. And everybody's like, oh, or somebody came out and tripped him, or, you know, he got nervous or whatever the case. I don't want to do it. That's all I'm going to think about. You're going to psych yourself out of the act to such a degree where you actually perform more negatively than you would have if you weren't impacted by this state anxiety, right? So that can create another form of communication apprehension, where you have something that you saw someone else experience, you know, or saw the misfortune of someone else in a similar scenario, and then you project that upon yourself, right? So it's very similar to the trait anxiety, but it's not necessarily how you feel. It's just something that you experience in some capacity. You have that same fear of a similar scrutiny or negative reaction that you from the trait anxiety. It's not specific to that. Right? Then of course there's scrutiny fear. Now this is just, you have a problem with people looking at you. A lot of us have this realistically, right? You feel like someone's watching you, you're uncomfortable, you're walking in a public place and you're thinking about who's thinking about you or who's watching you or how you look or whatever the case, you know. Very few of us are just carefree and where we don't care about these things. We think about these things. Some people to a greater degree than others, right? But in essence, that's scrutiny fear. It's less about the activity, but more about fear of being watched or observed, right? What people are thinking when you're doing this thing, right? And if it's problematic for you just walking through a square or a park or a store, then imagine what it's going to be when all eyes are actually on you, actually trained and focused on you, and you are having to do something that's related to school or work or whatever the case, and you have to perform well. It can be very unnerving. It can be very anxiety producing. It can be very and basically producing communication apprehension. I had a little communication apprehension, right? But how to fix communication apprehension, right? How to fix it. Now, CA is a resultant condition, right? It is a result of things. It's a result of your traits, it's a result of your state, it's a result of your memories, of his experiences, it's a result of just how you feel about being watched, whatever the case. So you have to minimize the apprehension by recognizing that it exists. It's there. I feel this way. Own it, right? Just like a bad experience or missing an ex in a relationship, it's like you gotta own it. You just gotta live it, feel the pain, feel the burn. It hurts. Okay, what am I gonna do about it, right? That's what it's all about. You have to engage in a practice called cognitive restructuring, right? Cognitive meaning your mind, and restructuring meaning changing things up, right? Making it go a little differently than it went initially. It can help you, right? Now this involves creating your frame of reference or your approach to this dissemination, right? You have to stand at the podium or at the table or in front of the room with this group of people watching you, right? You have to deliver on this content. Well, there's of course a couple practices that you can engage in to help you, and the specific things we'll get to momentarily. But let's talk about something generally. You have to start with a positive approach. I'm gonna rock this out. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna be great. They're gonna love me. I'm gonna be funny. I'm gonna be engaging. My content is going to be relevant, right? My audience is hopefully going to, if they don't already align with how I feel, I'll win them over. You have to have an optimistic approach to what you're doing. I don't want to sound like a self-help guru, but in essence, that's how you have to start the cognitive process. And I would argue that that's what you have to do in any scenario where you're building your mind to be optimistic about an endeavor, right? Whether it's starting a business or, you know, being successful in a classroom or acing an interview or being successful in a public speaking dissemination, right? All right. Positive attitudes rock. Next, you have to establish a habitual frame of reference, right? You already have that negative frame of reference. Oh, people are going to laugh at my teeth, or my nose is too big, right? Or I'm going to trip and fall like that one person in high school, or whatever the case, right? You have to change that frame of reference to think of something more positive, right? Hey, I'm unique and people are going to accept me. They're going to engage with my content. When I get up there, they're going to appreciate that I'm here and I am facing my fears, and they're going to root for me. Because more often than not, people root for the underdog, right? They want people to do well. There are a couple of twisted-minded individuals that want to see something negative happen to you, but you can't focus on those because that's the minority, right? The majority, they want you to do well. You have to focus in that area, right? You have to develop that positive frame of reference, and you have to make that a habit. Every time you go up to a podium, every time you're at the front of the room, every time you're engaging a group, hey, I am prepared, I am confident, and I'm aligned with my audience, and my audience is going to give me ethical feedback as well. And whatever it is, whether positive or negative, I want to build for the next opportunity And you do that every single time. Negative experience. Oh, yes, I see a hand.
I was just wondering, I've seen different speakers with disabilities be quite effective, but what about speakers that have communication difficulties?
Mm-hmm.
Is it still possible to be an effective speaker with
Yes.
with problems with your communication?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And this, the reason is because 80% of what we learn is nonverbal, right? So it's less about the content that's coming out, less about the verbiage that's coming out of your mouth, and more about what you're doing with your space, right? We can do so much with visual aids. We can do so much with our energy. We can do so much with our hands, right? Right? If you're conveying the importance of something, right? You can do that in so many more ways than just saying that it's important. And more often than not, less you saying it is important, but more you conveying the importance is what the audience is going to absorb, right? So again, there are hindrances to speaking in public, and you mentioned some of that. There can be physical disorders or disabilities. There can be, you can in accents. There can be confidence issues where your volume or your tone there's difficulties with the audience connecting in that regard. But if when we're building any area where we are with public speaking, we have to think of it as a total package, right? We're not just going to be louder. We're not just going to stop moving our mouths or our faces in a certain way or stop focusing on that. We're going to enhance our deficits, in essence. We're going to utilize those things to build other areas of where we're going to perform. So if you know that your voice doesn't carry, or that you may how you enunciate or pronounce words or whatever, it can be problematic at times. Then you want to use a visual aid that maybe has a closed captioning option that maybe accentuates or highlights specific words, right? So for instance, if I were doing that with a YouTube video, when I'm saying words like in this community, we are going to be stronger together. And maybe I have the word stronger together highlighted behind me. They'll come in, they'll kind of dissolve in and they'll kind of fade out or something. Or, maybe I'll utilize a visual aid where I have someone else conveying a thought, maybe a clip from a video or audio, or maybe I will utilize, nonverbal paralinguistics that will accentuate the content of that actual phrase or that actual idea, whatever it is I'm trying to basically sell the audience or to communicate to the audience. I do that beyond just saying the word, right? Right. For instance, what was I going to say? Just lost my train of thought. If I'm where's your belief? Where's your belief in whatever it is, right? Where is your belief in the education system? Is your belief here? Or is your belief here? Is it almost difficult to measure your belief because you're so passionate about how you feel, right? And then I want to have visual aids that represent this or that support this. Maybe I want to have lighting that supports this. And I also want to understand who my audience is. So I know that if they're going to be, non-receptive or hostile, that, they can have some information about where I'm going with my content so they can follow along. Maybe I'll provide a handout or a pamphlet, or like a fact sheet or whatever the case. So those things can all help you with selling the content that where they aren't solely, hanging on every word and waiting for the next thing you want to say.
Do you have any tips for recovery if you lose your word?
Absolutely.
The word you need. Okay.
Yeah. So to give me a second, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Just get into this last part here. So after working on that habitual frame of reference, right? Then you want to try to develop this personal frame of reference. You have a habitual frame of reference. I'm going to be great, right? I'm going to go up here. I'm going to do this. So that's you're building the positivity component for your approach. And then you want to develop this personal frame of reference, no matter what the number of individuals are or the source of the content that you're delivering. You want to make it personal, right? That's what I do. Like even right now, I don't know, unfortunately I'm not, well connected with everyone that's on the Zoom right now. I think we have like 25 individuals or something like that. I don't know you. The majority of you, I probably haven't had the connection with you outside of a class and a couple of emails, right? But you're my friends. right? I'm communicating and I'm joking and I'm being very casual, and that's what gives me comfort, right? I can be very serious, put my glasses on, and that's not me though. I'm going to be genuine to who I am, and hopefully the information connects. And in my previous my previous surveys, I haven't gotten too many bad marks, so it works for me. It's and so I continue the same habitual frame of reference, and I create the personal frame as well. Make it casual, and it's like I'm having breakfast with friends, right? Or we're at brunch together at the table. I would communicate the same way because it's just what I do. It's my frame. It's how I've created this comfort zone for when I'm disseminating in front of any group. And again, it can be 25 or it could be 2,500, right? I would be the same way. So the concept is simply that presenting is all about attitude and self-reflection, right? So it gets a little granola, a little goody-goody. It's all about restructuring you, right? But sure, ultimately it is, because communication apprehension is about either how you feel about yourself or what you feel you might have to endure because someone else did, right? Or you just not liking people looking at you. And that's all about changing how you feel about things and how you're approaching things, right? But for those actual, let me see here. They're on my other slide. Oh, okay. Let me do this really quickly. If you look at chapter 11, I'm stopping my presentation for a second just so I'm going to actually utilize the text. And sorry, I'm going to get you out of here for a second. So you guys are like, it's past 9:20. Okay. But take a look really quickly at chapter 11. And let me just bring this up for you really quickly. Because it has these really cool tactics that are beneficial for your growth and will aid you in speaking with confidence. And these are actually, I don't think they're on the exam. I have to double check. I would know these. I would aim to know these regardless. But these, let's see here. These techniques for building confidence here, let me just share, there you go, are something that you should just internalize anyway. I think I may have added them as extra credit or something. All right, so if you're looking at chapter 11, which is here, speaking with confidence, and this is the PDF, so you all have access to this. If you look down here on the chapter outline, we talked about scrutiny, all the communication apprehension, the habitual frame of references, cognitive restructuring, but this last area here might be the specific things that you were inquiring about and how to redirect or get the train back on the rails, so to speak. And these are techniques for building confidence, right? So they are generally speaking preparing well, right? And you hear that all the time, especially in academia, practice, right? Study, whatever the case. But it's true. If you want to be successful in public speaking, especially in a specific setting, a specific endeavor, then you want to be prepared for that endeavor. You want to know who's in the audience to the best of your ability. You want to know what your content is. You want to have a script in essence. And even if you don't, I wouldn't recommend a manuscript that you're reading verbatim or trying to memorize your speech, although that may be helpful for you. Having a generalized outline that will just give you the framework that you can refer to when you're giving the content, you're sharing the content. It will help you in just remaining focused and having that outline there, right? We'll talk about on Monday, or I'll talk about through Zoom on Monday with you there or not, the outlining and organizing component of speaking. You want to have an outline that's there for you, that's helpful and very focused on what the content is you're delivering. You're going to have two different outlines that you're going to create for each one of your speeches. You're going to create a preparation outline where you're going to have all these different things on there. You're going to scratch stuff in and scratch stuff out, and you're going to put different things in notes here and maybe give yourself little cues. And then you're going to develop a speaking outline, which will be your hard line outline that you'll actually use in your speech, and you'll submit to me. Right? It won't have all the scribble scrabble on there, all the scratch ins and outs. It'll be a final version that will be the perfected version that you will know is perfect because you will have practiced it before you got to that point. I recommend practicing every speech that you are going to share at least 3 times, at least with one other individual in your audience, not just to yourself. It may be helpful to do it on camera because you're going to be doing it, on video here to some degree, but I would recommend doing it for someone else so they can give you immediate feedback, right? But that visualizing success is important as well, right? You stumble, you lose your place. Take a break. Acknowledge it. I lost my train of thought. What are people going to do, right? They're going to burn you at the stake because you lost your train of thought. Hey, I lost my train of thought. Hold on for 1 second. Well, another good idea, and you just get right back to it, right? You take a look down, breathe, you take a drink of water, right? People want you to succeed more often than not, right? People want you to be successful. Unless you're, I was going to use the Kobe reference. Kobe's my favorite player, right? And obviously, he's no longer with us. But people did not want Kobe to succeed. But people loved Kobe. You didn't want him to win because he's won all the time. He's so intense, right? Oh, people don't want Kobe to win. But Kobe, he's a winner, right? So I say, like, Kobe, you don't want him to win. But maybe like a comparable person this day and age would be Tom Brady, right? People don't want Tom Brady to win. I was like, I'm sick of Tom. But Tom Brady's the best, right? He has the rings to prove it. He has the record to prove it. If you're not a football fan, I apologize for that analogy. But that's where I'm going with this, right? Hey, who doesn't want, you to succeed, right? And if those people are out there in the audience, that's not who you're focused on, right? So jumping back to our list really quickly so we can wrap this up. Visualizing success. What do you want to do? Have intention in your endeavor, right? If you're going up there to talk about, the best chocolate chip cookies in America, talk about the best chocolate chip cookies in America. If you're going there to give an outline or an overview of your family, your upbringing, then give an overview of your family and your upbringing, right? Stay focused, stay on task, stick to the script in essence, but have fun with it, right? Another thing you want to do is avoid gimmicks. You might think of something that's super clever, right? I know this is going to be funny. I know it's going to be cool. If it's gimmicky and it's lame and you feel in any way in your heart and soul it's going to be lame, don't do it, right? You have to feel that it's going to be funny or successful, or it's going to be heartwarming, or it's going to be endearing, or it's going to connect you to your audience. If you don't genuinely feel that in your heart, leave it out of your speech, right? Because when it's gimmicky, it's lame, and it doesn't come across as being, natural, then your audience is going to pick up on that. You, in essence, you create the energy around your speech, in essence, right? So if you aren't confident in your speech, your audience is they're going to sense that you're not confident in your speech. If you don't believe in a joke, your audience is going to believe in your joke, right? If you stumble, the only person that really knows is you, depending on how you manage that scenario. So you have to be confident and you have to be in control at all times when you're at that podium, right? Another way to do that is to breathe and release. Breathe before you start. You'll be surprised if you practice yoga or breathing techniques to manage, any aspect of your personality or your space. Then you know that breathing is like a magic drug, right? It can just make you feel better. Sometimes you have to just pause. You have to breathe, even in the middle of your speech, right? You're going through, you have this hard-hitting content, and you're on it, and you're getting too worked up. I do that. I get worked up. I have to breathe. And then you just change. I change my tone, right? Change the inflection. I bring it down a little bit. It's almost like changing, like turning the page or flipping to a new chapter. Sometimes you have to give those intentional pauses, and it may even accentuate the content that you're delivering. Minimizing what you memorize. Now, I know for some people it helps to memorize their speech, but when you do that, you put yourself, you paint yourself into a corner if it does get to a place where you can't remember what you have, because you'll need those specific cues, those actual words, just like if you were performing a song or something like that. You miss a line or two. If you're not really comfortable and really savvy, then it's going to throw off the whole rest of the song. You won't be able to get back on cue. The melody will be off. You lose the place. You don't know where the next thing happens, and then you can't get back on track with that. I recommend minimizing what you memorize. It's not about memorizing. I say script, but it isn't about memorizing a script as if you're, performing in a movie. I say have the idea of what's going to happen at the beginning, middle, and end. Have a outline there with you so you can refer back to it. Take a look at your outline. It's totally okay. Nobody's going to, rail on you for looking at your outline. Where you don't want to get into the habit of reading it like a manuscript because you disconnect with your audience. But you're connected with your audience. Another thing, right? Take a look there. I'm looking at the chapter book. I'm looking at my PDFs when I'm talking to you. I don't think it discredits what I'm saying, but it does keep me focused, and I can look over and I can come right back to you and reconnect with you. Practice out loud. When you are practicing your speeches, do it out loud. A lot of times when we're rehearsing things, we do it inside our mind, right? We're reading, right? But you need to do it, and you need to hear your own voice. You need to accentuate those words. You need to pronounce, right, and enunciate. You need to utilize the familiarity with the content to help you in your actual speech. And you'll do that when you heard yourself over and over again practicing it out loud. And do it in front of people as well. right? And the last but not least is to customize your practice. If you are going to be presenting in a very large space where your voice is going to carry, right? Or outside where there may be ambient sounds or miscellaneous noises that you can't control, then you need to practice in that environment, or at least anticipate those things in your practice, right? Because you could be in the middle of your speech, very nervous, and all of a sudden somebody's kid or something cries out or yells out or something like that, throw you off a little bit. But what are you going to do in that scenario? How are you going to right the ship, right? Then you're going to do a couple of things. You're going to remember that you prepared. You're going to continue to visualize your success. You're going to take a breath and breathe. Maybe you even acknowledge it. Whose baby is that? So cute. Well, back to what I was saying, right? You want to utilize these things that hopefully you practice and that are going to become innate. They're tools for your tool belt in essence. So building confidence in public speaking is all about having the most tools that you possibly can in your tool belt at any given time. So no matter what the task is, you can come in and say, I got the tool for that and I can do it, right? Remember those speaking competencies that we talked about in chapter 1? And if you haven't, if you weren't privy to that, privy to the Zoom session, and go back to chapter 1 and look at the speaking competencies, that'll help you as well. But then these techniques for building confidence will help you working off of those competencies in not only being prepared for your speech, but being successful and effective in your speech. All right. So that's chapter 11. Any questions about chapter 11 or about the exam right now? And I can answer them through email, or if you want to set up an appointment as well before Friday.